There are two OVO stories running at the exact same time right now, and Aubrey Drake Graham needs you looking at only one of them. The first story is the shiny one. ICEMAN is out, the charts are moving, the aura is back, the captions are screaming mogul, and the billionaire whispers are floating around the fanbase like they are certified fact. The second story is the one sitting in legal paperwork and business reporting. A lender says October's very own defaulted, signed a forbearance agreement acknowledging the debt, made only a partial payment from an account identified as ABG Sound Incorporated Management Account, and is now disputing that millions more are still owed. And if you think those are two separate stories, that is exactly where the trap starts. Because what looks like a victory lap on the surface may actually be the public unveiling of a cash pressure story that has been building behind the owl logo for a long time. And I need you to feel how uncomfortable that contrast really is before we go 1 inch further. Because the mainstream fan understanding of Drake right now is still built on scale, not structure. People hear global hits, sold-out tours, brand deals, headline dominance, and they assume the machine underneath all of that must be untouchable. But revenue is not cash flow, cultural heat is not balance sheet health, and a famous logo is not the same thing as a stable company. According to the lawsuit summary released by the lender, OVO generated roughly $72 million in revenue in 2024, while still sustaining cumulative losses between 2022 and 2024. So now we are not talking about a random celebrity rumor. We are talking about the difference between being loud and being liquid, between looking rich and having a capital structure that actually works when bills come due. Does everybody understand how different those two things are? And the layered mystery here gets even nastier when you add the second report. Because while this debt fight is becoming public, multiple outlets have also reported that Drake and his team are in discussions to sell a 50% stake in OVO to Authentic Brands Group, a licensing giant whose entire business is scaling brands through partnerships, distribution, and retail reach. So now the question is no longer, did Drake have a rough week? The real question is this: are we watching a boss move from a position of strength, or are we watching a luxury streetwear brand get pushed toward a licensing-heavy future? Because the numbers behind the curtain were not matching the mythology in front of it. That is a personal stake story for Drake, a cultural stake story for how hip-hop keeps mistaking branding for ownership, and a systemic stake story for the entire artist brand economy. And when we get to the part about the collateral, the personal guarantees, and what a 50% sale to a licensing platform usually does to a brand built on scarcity, that is when the whole picture changes. Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit like, and subscribe. Let's get into it. Because before we even get to the debt drama, we need to set the table properly on what October's very own actually became. OVO was established in 2008 in Toronto and publicly describes itself as a lifestyle brand founded by Drake, Oliver El Khatib, and Noah 40 Shebib. This is not some throwaway rapper merch operation. Official company materials describe a real apparel business, and the brand's own store pages show locations in Toronto, Mississauga, Scarborough, Ottawa, Calgary, Vancouver, Burnaby, Los Angeles, New York, and Las Vegas. That matters, because the more real the company is, the less anybody gets to handwave this as blog noise. The owl is not imaginary. The retail footprint is not imaginary. The cultural equity is not imaginary. That is exactly why the paperwork matters so much. And the brand did not get there by accident. OVO's identity was built through premium streetwear, controlled drops, and the feeling that you were not just buying fabric, you were buying access to a universe. Over time, that universe expanded into collaborations and sports-adjacent branding that pushed OVO beyond music fan merch and into a more mature lifestyle category. Hot 97 and Hot New Hip Hop both describe the brand as having grown through limited releases and collaborations with entities like the NHL, NFL, and entertainment properties such as Looney Tunes. While Drake's sneaker history with Jordan Brand and later the Nocta partnership with Nike helped cement the idea that OVO sat inside a broader, highly monetizable fashion ecosystem. In other words, this was supposed to be one of the crown jewels of the post-rap mogul playbook. That is why the timing matters so much right now. Drake is coming off a period where the public conversation around him has been wildly unstable. Yes, he still has scale. Yes, he still has money. Forbes listed him among the highest-paid musicians with $78 million on its 2025 earnings ranking. But Forbes listing annual earnings is not the same as confirming billionaire status. And the fan habit of inflating celebrity wealth into mythology is exactly how people get blindsided by stories like this. A person can earn huge numbers and still have businesses under pressure, financing stacks in motion, guarantees outstanding, and strategic sales under discussion. The methodology says invincible. The documents say complicated. And I think we need to set the truth on what the stakes actually are here, because this is bigger than whether one celebrity can pay one bill. If the reported debt dispute is exactly what the lender says it is, then OVO is not just dealing with embarrassment. It is dealing with leverage. If the reported ABG talks are real, then OVO is not just chasing growth. It may be deciding what kind of brand it can still afford to be. If the complaint's description of the broader financial picture is accurate, then this is also about whether the company's founders had to keep layering debt, guarantees, and fundraising on top of one another just to keep the machine moving. That is the tension driving this entire story. Was OVO expanding as a power move or expanding because the business had no choice but to keep feeding the structure? So let's get to the surface evidence, because the first thing that jumped out at me was not even the dollar figure. It was the timeline. According to the lender's lawsuit summary, ARI provided a senior secured credit facility in May 2025 and then 5 separate convertible promissory notes between July and August 2025 totaling about $5.2 million in principal. That alone tells you this was not one random invoice sitting under a pile of unopened mail. This was institutional financing, layered over multiple transactions, inside a formal capital strategy. That is grown-up business structure. And when grown-up business structure starts appearing in court filings, nobody gets to shrug and say, "Nah, it's Drake, he's good." Mr. Billionaire cosplay might be good personally. The question is whether the company was good structurally. Very different conversation. The second piece of evidence is the formal default date. The lender says it delivered a notice of default on February 27, 2026, after multiple events of default had occurred and were continuing. Think about how much has to happen before a lender gets to that stage. This is not, "Hey, just checking in on that transfer." This is contractual breakdown language. It means the relationship had already moved past friendly reminders into legal positioning. And once that happens, the energy changes. The story stops being about aura and starts being about documentation. Can we stop and think about how crazy that is for a brand still being publicly framed like an unstoppable extension of Drake's personal empire? The public sees owl hoodies and album momentum. The lender sees a borrower in default. The third piece of evidence is the forbearance agreement. And this is where the story gets deeply uncomfortable for the spin machine. According to the same lawsuit summary, OVO and ARI entered into a formal forbearance agreement on March 20, 2026. The lender says OVO expressly acknowledged that existing defaults had occurred and were continuing, and further acknowledged that the indebtedness and obligations were valid, binding, and unconditionally owing without set-off, defense, or counterclaim. If that description is accurate, that is not vague tension. That is not "we disagree on interpretation." That is a written acknowledgement, followed by a later dispute. And once you hear it in that order, the talking points get a lot harder to sell. The fourth piece of evidence is the partial repayment itself. The lender says it received a wire of roughly $3.8 million on May 27, 2026, but also alleges that the payment did not originate directly from OVO. Instead, it says the wire came from an account identified as ABG Sound Incorporated Management Account and referenced OVO notes. Now listen, I want to be precise here. A payment routing through a related entity does not automatically prove some scandal. Businesses use different entities all the time. But in the context of an alleged default, a formal forbearance agreement, and a subsequent dispute over millions still allegedly owed, that detail becomes extremely revealing. Why was the payment not coming cleanly from the company whose obligation is at issue? That is a fair question. And fair questions are exactly what the glaze factory hates. The fifth piece of evidence is the amount still allegedly outstanding. The lender says about $4.6 million remains contractually due and owing, including make-whole obligations, accrued default interest, legal fees, lender expenses, and enforcement costs. That matters because a lot of people hear they already sent almost $4 million and immediately assume the problem is basically over. No. If the lender's version is correct, the partial payment is not the ending of the story. It is proof that the story got serious enough for a large payment to happen while still not serious enough to resolve the dispute. That is an entirely different signal. A resolved business problem usually gets quieter. This one got louder. And the sixth piece of evidence might be the most devastating one on the surface level, because it is not about debt mechanics at all. It is about the company's reported operating picture. The lender's complaint, as summarized publicly, says OVO generated about $72 million in revenue during 2024, while sustaining about $12 million in cumulative losses between 2022 and 2024. Hot New Hip Hop similarly summarized the allegation as roughly $72 million in 2024 revenue, nearly $400 million from 2019 to 2024, and ongoing losses. Revenue with losses. Brand visibility with losses. Cultural heat with losses. This is exactly why I keep saying the wrong question is, how can a big brand owe money? The right question is, what did it cost that brand to look that big? And speaking of the wrong question, let's talk about how this got framed publicly, because that framing is evidence too. The OVO sale headlines did not arrive wrapped in panic. They arrived wrapped in ambition. Articles emphasized that Drake was coming off ICEMAN, that OVO could be worth hundreds of millions, and that a partnership with Authentic Brands Group could dramatically expand the brand's licensing opportunities. That is how you know we are not just dealing with facts here. We are dealing with narrative sequencing. One story says pressure. The other says expansion. One says default. The other says dynasty. And oh, does the fanbase ever love the second version? And oh, do I have more for you, because the OWL Defense Squad is really not going to enjoy this next part. If you thought the debt timeline was rough, wait until we put it next to the cultural reaction cycle that immediately tried to convert all of this into another Drake playing chess while y'all play checkers speech. Because the very thing being sold as a power move may be the clearest sign, yet that the brand can no longer afford to stay what made it cool in the first place. And when we get to the part about how licensing companies actually make money, and what happened to Roqueware, Sean John, and Billionaire Boys Club when similar structures entered the picture, that is where the whole he lost nothing routine starts sounding like pure industrial strength cope. The first layer of cultural evidence is the media and social framing around the ABG rumor itself. Hot 97 amplified a post summarizing the report as breaking news that Drake was reportedly selling a 50% stake in OVO to Authentic Brands Group, then immediately positioned the move as proof that OVO had evolved into a global lifestyle enterprise. That framing matters. It tells you the first instinct of the culture was not concern. It was applause. Not why now, but look how big this is. That is how star power bends interpretation. A regular founder selling half his brand to a licensing giant, while one lender is publicly alleging default. People would ask if the walls were closing in. A rap megastar does it, and suddenly everybody wants to call it genius before the ink even exists. The second layer is how trade style and business-adjacent coverage kept using expansion language even while acknowledging that the terms were unclear and the deal was unconfirmed. Black Enterprise and Yahoo's picked-up version both emphasized that ABG could significantly expand OVO's global licensing and retail footprint, while allowing Drake and his partners to retain significant ownership and creative influence. That sounds great. It really does. But retain influence is one of those phrases that often sounds stronger in a headline than it feels in a boardroom. Influence is not control. Creative role is not capital priority. And ownership split is not brand destiny. What I want everybody to understand is that language like this can simultaneously be true and still hide a much harsher business reality underneath it. The third layer of cultural evidence is the fan theory cycle that immediately moved to rationalization. Hot New Hip Hop explicitly noted that some fans believed the possible sale might be a way to mitigate debt issues, while also allowing that it could be a separate matter. And that is actually useful because it shows the culture doing what it always does around superstar brands, trying to merge discomfort into a cleaner narrative. Maybe it is a rescue. Maybe it is unrelated. Maybe it is both. Maybe it is genius. Maybe it is temporary. Notice what never happens first in those conversations. Sitting still with the possibility that a very successful artist can still have a business that is financially stressed. The culture hates that sentence because it ruins the fantasy that visibility and solvency are the same thing. The fourth layer is the mythology around Drake's wealth itself. And this is where Mr. Billionaire cosplay really enters the chat. Forbes' profile page does not list Drake as a billionaire. It lists him on a highest paid musicians ranking, with 2025 earnings of $78 million. Again, huge number. Nobody is saying Drake is broke. That is not the point. The point is that fans often promote a level of limitless personal financial invincibility that is not the same thing as what public business reporting actually shows. The wealth myth becomes a shield that makes people ignore actual structure. They hear Drake and assume every affiliated entity is untouchable. But the company's own alleged need for external capital and the lender's description of defaults tell you that star wealth and corporate financing are not interchangeable. The fifth cultural signal is subtler, but I think it matters just as much. The way success stories around ICEMAN are being used as emotional cover for business uncertainty. Several reports paired the ABG story with reminders that Drake was still chart-relevant and commercially strong. That is not accidental. The music comeback aura and the brand sale narrative reinforce one another. One says he is still culturally hot. The other says the company is still strategically valuable. Put them together, and the audience is encouraged to interpret every move as dominance instead of asking whether dominance is being actively monetized because the structure needs it. Can we have the real conversation now? Cultural momentum can raise the price of a deal. It can also create the perfect moment to sell, because you need the strongest possible story around an asset before the harder questions arrive. Now, to be fair, there is a counterargument here, and I want to give it its proper respect before I break its knees. The counterargument is simple. Major brands borrow all the time. Brands do restructuring all the time, and bringing in a licensing partner does not automatically mean distress. All true. Completely true. But that argument only works cleanly if the surrounding facts are also clean. Here, according to the publicly summarized complaint, we are not just looking at ordinary financing. We are looking at alleged default, a written forbearance acknowledgement, a partial payment from a different account, a remaining dispute over millions, and reported talks to sell half the brand. When too many normal things line up in the same direction, they stop feeling normal. They start feeling like a pattern. And that pattern is the hard gear shift, because up to this point we have still been talking in the language of headlines, fans, and optics. But the real story sits deeper than all of that. The real story is not, did Drake catch another bad week? The real story is what happens when an artist-founded brand built on scarcity, identity, and peak aura positioning runs into the cold mechanics of debt, collateral, licensing, and institutional capital. That is the part basic reaction channels do not want to touch, because once you touch it, the entire system opens up. The first systemic angle is collateral, and this is where the conversation stops being cute. A lender extending a senior secured facility to a brand company is not just handing over money because the owl looks good on a hoodie. It wants protection. The lawsuit summary repeatedly refers to financing agreements, creditor protections, enforcement rights, and ongoing reporting obligations. That means the brand itself is part of the economic engine being monitored and protected. Once a brand's value is deeply tied to intellectual property, licensing opportunities, and retail presence, that IP becomes central to every leverage conversation. So when people say, it's just 4-point-something million, Drake can handle that, they are missing the structural point. The issue is not simply the size of the check. The issue is what parts of the business architecture may already be spoken for when the check becomes disputed. The second systemic angle is the capital stack itself. According to the lender's public summary, OVO was not just dealing with one instrument. It had the senior secured credit facility, the convertible notes, and, according to the complaint, an existing Royal Bank of Canada credit facility under which Drake, Oliver El-Khatib, and Noah Shebib had personally guaranteed obligations. The complaint also says OVO was simultaneously pursuing a $30 million equity financing transaction, with one objective being repayment of about $10 million of existing indebtedness and the release of those personal guarantees. Read that slowly. Debt, more debt, personal guarantees, equity raise, existing indebtedness. If accurate, that is not the capital structure of a brand casually floating through life on good vibes and owl emojis. That is a company actively working multiple financing lanes at once. And this is exactly where the average fan gets trapped by the glamour of revenue. But they did $72 million. Okay, and? Revenue tells you activity. It does not tell you margin quality, operating expense pressure, lease obligations, inventory risk, wholesale dynamics, promotional cost, staffing burn, or the cash timing mismatch between what you sell and what you owe. A store network is not just flex, it is overhead. A collaboration calendar is not just cool, it is operational complexity. A premium brand can absolutely look elite on the outside, while bleeding quietly on the inside if the cost base and financing burden are not aligned. That is why they made a lot of money, is one of the weakest possible defenses in a debt story. The third systemic angle is licensing economics. And this is where the ABG piece becomes much more than a random business rumor. Authentic Brands Group is not some boutique operator that comes in to preserve the poetry of a subculture. Authentic's own corporate site says it is a leading sports, media, entertainment, and lifestyle platform with 50-plus brands, more than $36 billion in annual retail sales, over 1,700 partners, 31,000 plus stores and shop-in-shops, and presence across more than 150 countries. That is a scale machine. That is industrial licensing muscle. That is a company built to turn intellectual property into distribution, which is excellent if your priority is monetization breadth. It is a much more complicated proposition if your priority is preserving the aura of exclusivity that made the brand matter in the first place. And let me say that another way. OVO's cultural power came from feeling specific. It was Toronto-coded, Drake-coded, limited, premium, controlled, and attached to a certain era of elite emotional rap luxury. Licensing giants extract value differently. They scale categories, extend availability, broaden channels, and optimize recognizable trademarks across more touchpoints. Those two logics can coexist for a while, but they are not the same logic. Scarcity builds mystique. Scale eats mystique. Scarcity says, you had to be there. Scale says, we can put this everywhere. So if OVO really is preparing to sell 50% to a company like ABG, the question is not just how much cash comes in. The question is which version of OVO survives after the cash arrives. And hip-hop history gives us receipts on this. Jay-Z sold Rocawear to Iconics Brand Group in 2007 for $204 million in cash, with as much as $35 million more in stock if targets were met, while retaining involvement in development, marketing, and licensing. At the time, Rocawear was doing more than $700 million in annual retail sales, according to the reporting. On paper, monster move. Pure mogul cinema. But that model also represented the transformation of a culture-heavy fashion line into something increasingly governed by licensing logic. Again, I am not saying every licensing deal is automatically bad. I am saying hip-hop has seen this movie before, and the applause always comes before the postmortem. Sean John gives you another chapter in the same textbook. Reuters confirmed that Sean Diddy Combs later secured court approval to buy back Sean John from bankrupt owner GBG USA for about $7.55 million after Global Brands Group's U.S. unit filed for Chapter 11. Billboard added that Sean John had built to around $450 million in annual retail sales in 2016 before Diddy sold a 90% stake that year, only for the relationship to sour and the brand to wind up in bankruptcy proceedings. Again, huge cultural brand, major sale, licensing, and distribution logic. Then years later a buyback out of distress. That is not a fairy tale. That is a caution sign with lights on it. Pharrell's Billionaire Boys Club story rhymes too. Forbes reported that Pharrell bought back Iconics' 50% stake in BBC Ice Cream in 2016 after that stake had been held through a broader partnership structure linked to Rock Apparel, and then Iconics. The exact economics are different, of course, but the pattern is familiar. Artist-founded cultural brand, outside licensing structure, eventual retrenchment, reclaiming control. Does that mean Drake is guaranteed to replay those outcomes? No. But if you ignore those precedents entirely and scream, Infinity Stones, every time an artist sells part of a brand to a licensing platform, you are not analyzing. You are cheerleading. Now here is the major truth bomb, and I want to say it clearly, carefully, and without the fan base pretending I said more than I said. Based on the publicly reported facts we have right now, this does not look like a simple story of Drake cashing out from a position of uncomplicated dominance. It looks, at minimum, like the public phase of a financially pressured strategic transition. A lender says OVO defaulted. The lender says OVO acknowledged the debt in a formal forbearance agreement. The lender says OVO made only a partial repayment from a different account and now disputes owing millions more. At the same time, multiple outlets report that Drake's team is in discussions to sell 50% of OVO to one of the most aggressive licensing platforms in the business. You do not need conspiracy theories when the sequence itself is already loud. What I think is happening here is that the market is finally forcing a distinction Drake's mythology has been able to blur for years. The distinction between celebrity scale and enterprise resilience. Celebrity scale can sell records, move merch, launch collabs, and flood timelines. Enterprise resilience is quieter. It is about margins, debt covenants, reporting obligations, cash management, lender relationships, and whether the core asset can remain culturally premium while also carrying the financial weight placed on it. Those are not glamorous words, but they are the words that decide who actually owns what tomorrow. And when those words start colliding with a star whose brand has long benefited from the assumption of endless leverage, the reckoning is brutal because it is not happening on a stage. It is happening in documents. The deepest implication is this. If the reported ABG talks advance, the cultural equity OVO spent years building may be used to solve a short-term financial problem at a cost of long-term brand distinctiveness. That is the trade. That is the uncomfortable possibility sitting underneath all the chest beating. A brand built on selective access gets handed to a platform built on scaled access. A logo once worn like a signal becomes a logo that can be optimized. A mythology once tied to Drake's peak command era becomes something broader, safer, more commercial, and potentially much less special. While the fan pages are typing boss move, the real question may be whether the very move that protects the balance sheet is also the move that dilutes the soul of the asset. And that is why he only lost half of OVO language, dramatic as it sounds, gets at something real even if the negotiations remain unconfirmed and incomplete. Because in cultural businesses, half is not always just a percentage. Half can be the line between stewardship and surrender. Half can be the point where the founder still appears everywhere in the marketing, while the economics and decision-making logic shift somewhere else entirely. Half can be enough to save the house and still change the neighborhood forever. If this deal happens, the number itself will matter less than the direction of travel it confirms, away from scarcity-led self-definition and toward platform-led monetization. And once that shift starts, it almost never reverses without pain. So, who is actually winning here? The hero in this story is not a rival rapper stepping out from behind the curtain. The hero is discipline. The hero is structure. The hero is the cold, boring truth that a real business has to work even when the comment section is still drunk on aura. That is the part the culture never wants to celebrate, because discipline is not sexy until indiscipline gets exposed. But look at the facts we just walked through. The thing that keeps surviving every paragraph is not the spin. It is the paperwork. The thing that keeps demanding respect is not the fantasy. It is the structure. And in the long run, the brands and artists who understand that difference always outlast the ones who confuse visibility for invulnerability. That does not mean OVO is dead. Let me be very clear. OVO is still a real brand with real stores, real recognition, real collaborators, and real consumer memory. The issue is not whether the company exists. The issue is which version of the company gets to exist next. The scarcity-driven original? The scaled licensing-era sequel? The debt-restructured middle ground? One person built a brand that felt rare. The system now wants to find out how much value can be extracted from making it less rare. That one sentence is the whole story. And if you have made it this far, you already know why the people pretending this is nothing are working overtime. Because once you see the distinction, you cannot unsee it. The satisfying part, if there is one, is that reality always collects. It may take longer than the fanbase wants. It may arrive through dry filings instead of dramatic speeches. It may come in clauses, not captions. But it collects. And the culture does eventually course correct when the receipts become too specific to meme away. That is why I am not interested in pretending this is the end of Drake or the end of OVO. That is lazy. What matters more is that the illusion of effortless invincibility has taken another direct hit. And when illusions start breaking, everybody has to operate more honestly after that. This is only the start, and the next developments are not abstract. First, the British Columbia case itself matters, because OVO's formal legal response to the lender's claims will tell us whether this becomes a straight debt fight, a settlement path, or the first public slice of a much bigger restructuring story. Second, the reported ABG talks matter, because if those discussions turn into an actual transaction, then we will finally see whether this was expansion theater, financial necessity, or both at once. Third, the broader financing picture matters, because if the complaint's references to the RBC facility, personal guarantees, and a contemplated equity raise are even directionally accurate, then the 4-point-something headline is just the appetizer. So stay close, because when the next filing hits, when the next trade report drops, or when those ABG talks either solidify or disappear, we are going to revisit this with the same energy and the same receipts. And if you want the next layer of this story, the one that connects Drake's broader leverage, his post-beef positioning, and why public aura so often gets used to mask private pressure, that is the video you need to watch next. Because the shock is not that a superstar brand can wobble. The shock is how many people will still call it a master plan, even while the structure underneath it is begging for oxygen.